Episode 67, Wood, Part 1, Money in Masts and Barrels. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week will be part 1 of looking at the way wood interacted with food in the 18th century North American colonies. Last century, food was extremely dependent on wood, and in the 18th century, that continues. But now the relationship is made profitable, though in some cases it was also made contentious. New technologies were established in this age that will start changes in American food we live with today, but probably don't think about much. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while the 17th century relationship with wood was mostly on a survival basis, in the 18th century the same activities were there, but more were added, and those were the ones that were made to pay. In the 17th century, England was running up against the end of its large wood stores, at least those that were reasonably reachable or were not excluded from harvesting because they were in preserves of the crown or on the lands of one royal favorite or another. The days of the forest primeval, or at least forest since the last encroachment of an ice age, were largely gone. The wood stocks for fuel and general building had recovered from human use over the 14th and 15th centuries, that is, the years following the worst of the visitation of the Black Death or bubonic plague. But the investments in the new iron smelting and forging technology Henry VIII made to feed his war machine, and then the rapid expansion of the population and the cities under Elizabeth I's long reign had pushed the accessible wood stocks to lows never considered by people who had never even thought about the stuff of the earth running out. Especially when the manufacture of cannon had been combined with the rise of England's sea power, for boats require not just trees, but very specific trees. That is, very large and old specimens. If you're managing your forests as 30 to 50-year woodlots, those big trees are not going to appear. Thinking about trees in multi-hundreds of years was not a concept that had entered into many people's minds. If Britannia was going to continue on this rule the waves thing, they needed to find a source for their spars and masts. Until they spied the giant white pines of the New World, England and its admiralty were having to tiptoe through the Baltic Sea, while the Dutch, the Swedish, the Danes, the Prussians, the Russians, and other various principalities, dukedoms, and states were playing rotating frenemies, and also competing for the wood to build their own boats. So once the English saw the tall pines of New England and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, sure, the trees might be further away, but the diplomacy was simpler, and there was no competition worth acknowledging. I find it hard to believe that England's prowess at sea, in trading and fighting, could have ever reached the heights that it did without mining the east coast of North America for its 200-foot-tall white pines, and mining was exactly the mindset the British had when it came to the resources of the New World. Even though trees, with relatively little help, are self-replicating at phenomenal scales, the English had managed to strip mine their own island of important wood stocks, and then brought the same mindset to the shores of the New World. When the 17th century colonists disembarked, they certainly had plans to use as much of the apparently endless forest that greeted them as they possibly could. The approach was rather childish and even wasteful, as they slashed and burned, built barrels, and shipped off as much wood for cash across the Atlantic as they could. They were mainly paying off debts for their passage rather than raising money. The money-making and keeping it in the New World activities largely fell to the 18th century. To the credit of the Crown, they had learned at least a little when it came to great big trees. If they wanted them reserved for His Majesty's boats, they were going to have to do more than just, think about it. Thus appeared the King's Broad Arrow. This was 3 hatchet or axe marks in the bark, one straight up and 2 others flaring out at an angle, making the sign of an arrowhead, and was struck in any likely-looking tree by agents or at least speculators for the Crown. By 1691, the reservation of trees was codified in the revision of the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter, stating that all trees greater than 24 inches in diameter, 12 inches off the ground, were reserved for mast timbers, if they were to be found within 10 miles of a navigable river on Crown lands, and at this point almost everything was Crown lands, as this was the time of the Navigation Acts, which were already ruffling the feathers of the more industrious colonists. Such a rule was largely ignored on the ground, especially since most of the people interested in enforcement were at least 2 months away by boat, not to mention the overland travel. One of the areas where annoyance over this rule, and the rules to come, were the most heated was in the colony of New Hampshire. Borders disputed, for it fought with New York over ownership of the land that was to become Vermont, and for good measure had a little corner in French Quebec. For anyone with any familiarity with New Hampshire, they are not surprised to learn that it began its existence with contentiousness, disputes with neighbors both foreign and domestic. To enforce this white pine directive, inspectors all over New England would pop out with their rulers and fine home and business owners if they were found to have pine boards in their buildings and furniture over 22 inches in width. As brighter heads prevailed in ship planning, they decided that 24-inch diameter trees were doomed to run out if no smaller trees were ever allowed to get to the 24-inch size. So in 1722, it was made illegal by the New Hampshire General Court to cut down any white pine for use in domestic industry if it were greater than 12 inches in diameter at 12 inches off the ground. And in hopes of tracking down what white pines were cut down, a license was supposed to be bought for cutting white pines in one's own land. This rule was observed with as much respect as the previous one. In 1721, a king's surveyor reported that in just New Hampshire, in a single year, as many as 25,000 logs that should have been reserved for the crown had gone to domestic use. For all logging was hard work, and one got much more wood for a given amount of effort with those large trees. These people on the labor-starved frontier were fond of any labor savings they could get. In the 1760s, the crown decided, with all the wars going on, the ships getting bigger, and the fact that much more money was at stake, it was time to get serious with these white pine scofflaws. Instead of just yelling at New England and New Hampshire, specifically from across the water, it was time to install a governor and get some accountability or something. So in the 1770s, when things were heating up between the colonies and the home island, it wasn't just the Stamp Act and the Quartering Act and the ridiculous price gouging for inferior tea that was ruffling revolutionary feathers. Wood was also involved. After decades of ignoring the 24-inch and then the 12-inch law with almost no consequences, all of a sudden, a deputy surveyor for the governor of New Hampshire went ahead and impounded the illegally large logs found at 6 sawmills around the colony. Some paid up and got the logs back, but others refused. One of those who refused was arrested by the sheriff and a deputy, but allowed to return home to bring back bail money. Instead of following through on this plan, though, the scofflaw gathered his neighbors and attacked the sheriff and the deputy and chased them out of town on horses that had had their ears docked and were shorn of their manes and tails. When 8 of the participants of this outrage were brought up on charges, they were given light fines by a sympathetic judge. There are academic hypotheses that state that the light consequences for this nonsense was part of the encouragement for the tea-tossing scheme in Boston Harbor and other less famous docks several months later. For mention of this pine tree riot and the consequences have been found in correspondence surrounding the planning of the tea protests. Which brings us around to another interesting aspect of the North-South colonial divide. In the broad strokes, the southern colonies tended to have more royalist leanings. The wealthy large landowners, many of whom had been granted lands by the crown, saw themselves as extended members of the nobility, and many of them were that, but often younger sons who had gone off to seek their fortunes and made it. They also tended to have more direct connections to London, providing regular streams of materials, rice, indigo, tobacco, salt, beef, and large amounts of pine tar, resin, turpentine, and pitch. These tree materials were an annual crop that did not require large, old trees. In fact, they were often the first money a farmer made when they cleared lands for new fields. So the king's broad arrow and prohibitions on wood harvesting never touched them. And the rural nature of the southern colonies and the huge wealth divide between the large landowners and the rural settlers meant that things like Stamp Acts and Quartering Acts did not affect these colonists the way the residents of urban environs of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were. Meanwhile, in the northern New England colonies, those areas that grew white pines, like the rugged parts of New Hampshire that spawned the pine tree riot, were largely unfarmable. And the large white pines were limited. If the crown claimed them, there was nothing for the residents to profit from. Unlike the pitch and tar and turpentine, which were functionally annual crops, once large timber was felled, there was no replacement. So the white pine restrictions were seen as invasive and overstepping in the north in ways they were not visible in the south. But it wasn't just big wood, boat trees, and those early shingles and siding boards for construction that were being sent to England and Europe for profit. With the scientific revolution, the transformation of alchemy to chemistry, the printing press and all, metallurgy had improved, and so had tools. Oh, and glue as well. Now, why does this matter? The decorative woods of the globe were now entering Western Europe. Fine bladed saws were possible, along with finer knives and rasps and awls and so on. The result? An explosion in the art of inlay and marquetry. What is this, you ask? Using teeny tiny pieces of wood, either in their natural variety of colors or dyed, and then occasionally supplemented with slivers of shell to create pictures on armoires, chests, presses, and caskets. The 18th century examples of this, available to view in the decorative art section of any big city museum anywhere in the world, can be stunning. And yes, I'll put links and photographs of examples in the show notes. Wood inlay is an art that existed for a few thousand years all around the Mediterranean and in East Asia. It's an art form that has had periods of wild creativity at different times and places around the globe. Just a few famous places it can be found include Egyptian grave goods, as well as 13th century Islamic structures, and is found amongst imperial Chinese decor. But it was the 18th century when it was at its height in Europe. And no wonder. Why not decorate your home with furnishings that display intricately carved pictures that include ebony wood from India or Indonesia, mahogany from New Spain in South America, and sassafras wood from the Virginia colony in North America? Add in tortoiseshell harvested from the Caribbean, and mother of pearl, that iridescent lining of certain snail shells from far shores. And you are presenting in your home the equivalent of that sea pot pie, with 6 different meats all at once. And it's hard to ignore the implications of global trade on art styles. The landscapes and garden scenes on the porcelain from East Asia, the puzzle-piecing techniques picked up from the masters of inlay in Arabia and North Africa left their marks all over 18th century European marquetry. Tracing the transfer of technique to Italy and Spain and then north at this time would be a really interesting art history project. Wood inlay also existed independently in its own stylistic traditions in the wood-rich regions spreading out from the Baltic Sea, visible in items in Prussia and regions around the Caucasus Mountains. But the 18th century in Western Europe is when and where many global threads all came together to create a style unique to its place and time. The convergence of subjects and visual language in these cultures taking part in global trade can particularly be seen in the representation of floral subjects, in both the kind of flowers and in the shapes and techniques used to represent them. Mark this as the first truly global trade age of the world. It's wild to think how our current homogenization of music, art, and fashion can be linked to this period over 300 years ago. The convergent styles are visible, particularly in the caskets and presses that decorated the bedchambers and day rooms of princesses, duchesses, marquesas, grafen, and noble ladies of all sorts, along with the members of the nouveau riche merchant houses. But in the grand scheme of things, the export of fancy wood for fancy items didn't make much of an impression in the wood market, and has no particular effect on the development of mainstream food of future America. Other than, of course, reinforcing what food was fancy and would be replicated. And it did influence how dining rooms would be decorated for centuries to come. The place food and wood really crossed paths was in the barrel. Along with boat material, the other cash-generating skilled woodcraft product was barrel staves and headboards. Staves are the part that make the bulgy cylinder of the barrel, and the head is the top and the bottom. This was the fate of many trees felled in the New World that were fed into the ever-hungry maw of England. And in the 18th century is when colonial barrels started to more frequently have iron bands rather than the wooden ones of antiquity, and that has to do with charcoal. But before I can get to charcoal, I can't skip over barrels. As I mentioned last time I talked wooden barrels back in episode 24, they have been around a very long time, and were as essential an element in the transport of goods in the pre-industrial world as the wheel. To give you a sense of how much barrels mattered, from the time of the establishment of Jamestown, the single most common occupation in the southern colonies was cooper, or barrel maker, from that time until the Civil War, just over 250 years later. It's also important to know that along with the range of sizes of barrel, there were two main classes of barrel, and the other one. The other one was the gum barrel, so named because the favored versions were made from gum trees, which rot from the inside out, so only a little work has to be done to smooth and hollow it out to make it a reasonable size. But these are homely barrels, produced only for local storage. They lacked that center bulge and flexibility that made barrels useful for transport. The two barrel types that were the money makers and moved the trade in global food and other goods were the slack or dry barrel and then the wet or tight barrel. These were the ones made out of staves and held together with willow, hickory, or hazel hoops. Just for a sense of scale, in 1754, 116,000 barrels passed through Charleston exporting the goods produced in this area. And at about the same time, 230,000 barrel staves were exported in a single year, just from the upper reaches of the James River. This doesn't take into account likely similar amounts from other major port cities of the colonies, and it was common for a load of cargo to include 50,000 staves and 30,000 boards for the barrel heads. And just so you know, the most common barrel type required about 30 staves, plus or minus. While the wet or tight barrels, those that could hold liquid and powdery things like rum and flour, were the most desired, the level of skill and precision wasn't necessary for many of the commonly shipped objects. Hardtack, tobacco, deer hide, salt cod, apples, wax cheeses, large sturdy items that wouldn't sift out of slack joints could be transported in these dry barrels. And these barrels, they required less precision and were under less stress, so they could be made faster and required less manipulation and less strength. As a result, not only were these made by apprentices training to work on the more complex wet barrels, they were also put together by women and children. A remarkably large number of slack barrels were also manufactured by the enslaved people to export the goods they grew and harvested and processed. The popular depiction of the cooper is a European man in his linen shirt, hair pulled back in a tidy queue. But plenty of barrels were made by women in their voluminous skirts and caps, aided by children and enslaved captives, men and women and children who were forced to work on these barrels in their rough burlap tunics. Slack barrels, because they were not as tightly constructed, could also be collapsed and shipped back empty to the source of the goods, an advantage the barrel definitely had over the modern shipping container. The fact that they were not required to have perfectly fitted joins meant that they could be constructed from a variety of woods. The hardwoods needed to make wet barrels were not required, so they were easy to repair. Replacing a stave or a headboard when water tightness is not required is a much easier task. But the fact that these were loose and easier to collapse as they broke down also meant that slack barrels didn't hang around once they were out of use. After enough uses, they collapsed easily, so became more valuable as dry kindling than as auxiliary storage. Almost every single old-timey barrel we see now, representing the food and commerce of the past, looking scenic, is a retired wet or tight barrel. These are much hardier, sturdier objects. First of all, they were made exclusively with hardwoods, and oak was the preferred version due to the way the grain, or xylem and phloem, the circulatory system of the wood, runs. These were the barrels that required the highest level of skill and the highest quality of materials to manufacture. Wet barrels are always the ones to use metal hoops, and did so for much longer than I had realized. There are even reports by Romans of Celts using copper hoops on their barrels of cider or mead. But more generally, you can approximately date drawings containing barrels, especially in the North American British colonies, as coming before the middle of the 18th century or after, depending on how many hoops are on the barrels. Before the middle of the 18th century, when iron forging and finishing was finally established on colonial shores, nearly every barrel had wood hoops. As a result, the number of hoops will range between about 6 to 10, depending on the size of the barrel and the type of wood used in the hoops. But after iron becomes much more plentiful, iron hoops, fixed in place with hoop nails, start to take over the scenery. The 3 metal hoop design we see now in everything from emojis to sketches and charts comes from the rise of iron in America and, frankly, in the world. For the hickory or willow wooden hoops were subject to stretching and breaking. Every ship that carried cargo, worth anything, had a cooper on board. They monitored the health of the hoops on the barrels, had tools and materials to make repairs, and mallets to shift recalcitrant staves and hoops back into true. Remember that these barrels were going through the temperature and humidity shifts of the unclimate-controlled ships of the 18th century. Along with the smashes and crashes and slams, these relatively little boats suffered as they made the multi-month-long passages across the Atlantic, north and south, east and west, or even further afield to the Pacific and Indian Oceans, with occasional dips into the stormy ring of the Antarctic Ocean. And these voyage lengths were only going to increase as naval blockades, whaling, and global trade all became more common. Those iron hoops, and iron and steel generally, its production and use, were on the rise in the North American colonies. And that was due to more people to do more mining, blooming, and blacksmithing, more French and Spanish to fight, and apparently all the wood anyone would ever need to burn. And the expertise to efficiently turn it into charcoal. And I have realized after swatting up on the history of charcoal, that in turn requires a little walk through the basics of the Iron Age. It's all too much to cram into this week's episode, so after the disintegration of version 1 of this episode into electrons last week, I guess it's just as well. For in order to get to the bottom of aging distilled spirits and charred barrels and a look at the birth of what will become American barbecue, requires that we do a little history of charcoal, which, as with so many other topics, will take us back across the Atlantic. There's a lot there worth learning about. I mean, there's way more Africa involved in all these things than I had ever been led to believe. And that Voyage Iron Saga from episode 3 even has a cameo. So join me next week as we move from just plain old wood to charcoal and all the ways that changes food in the 18th century and how we live with the results, even right now, today. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Oh, and interesting tidbits are welcome as well. I'm never mad at a source or an anecdote. I've gotten some really fun reading material that way. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm headed in an interesting direction. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and a link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Insta bio @THOA Food and in the show description.